In section 8.1/8.2, we're going to cover both sections together because the ideas in both sections kind of overlap, and it'll make it a little bit more seamless. What we're going to talk about is a natural extension of what the confidence intervals were from Chapter 7. What we're now going to go over is called hypothesis testing. And this is probably something you've heard of in a science course, but this is going to be the statistical background of what people do after an experiment is actually done to figure out what do you know. Now, practically speaking, sometimes we find things out that we're not necessarily happy with. Sometimes we get exactly what we expect from an experiment, and sometimes tests are inconclusive, meaning, hey, I need to decide whether or not this is worth putting more money into and testing it a little bit more, or if I'm just going to bail because I'm still not sure. So, we're going to be looking at hypothesis testing, and in this first section, we're going to primarily look at hypothesis testing for proportions. But we're going to be looking at hypothesis testing for this whole section and seeing what we're going to do here. But before we can even get into how to do a test and how to do anything, we have to make sure that we know how to set up our test correctly, which means how to set up our hypothesis. Well, we're always going to start out with two sets of hypotheses. One, which is called an H0 or an H0, because the 0 looks like a little knot. This is called the null hypothesis. This H0, this H0 is called the null hypothesis. And we're going to also look at one other type of hypothesis. It's got an H with a little 1 on it. I will warn you, some books put a little A instead of a 1. On the alternative, this is your H1, is what's called your alternative hypothesis. So this H1 here is called your alternative hypothesis. And because it's called an alternative hypothesis, some books will use an A for alternative instead of the 1. So what we'll do is we're going to always set up, before we do anything in our hypothesis testing, these two pieces, an H0, your null hypothesis, and an H1, your alternative hypothesis. Now, how are we going to set these up? Because first, what we're going to actually do is determine what our claim is that we're stating in our original problem. Then we'll see where it fits. Is it going to fit in as our null hypothesis or our alternative hypothesis? We're going to have to determine that after we figure out what the claim even is. If the claim had an equal to of any kind, as in an equal to, a greater than or equal to, or a less than or equal to, then the claim will go in as your H0, your null hypothesis. If it does not have an equal to, meaning it's got a not equal to, a less than, or a strictly greater than, then our claim would instead be our H1. And we do want to make sure that we label which one actually does end up being our claim. Then, once we've figured out where the claim falls, whether it's the null hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis, we do need to fill in the missing hypothesis. And they are going to be complements or opposites. They'll be complements or opposites. So, what that means is, if I end up with an equal to in my claim, and it ends up being the null hypothesis, it means that the alternative will be the same but with the opposite, a not equal to. If, let's say, the claim ends up having a less than, then the reverse is going to be popping up the exact same claim, except for you'll have the complement, which is the greater than or equal to symbol in the H0, the null hypothesis. If you have a less than or equal to in your null hypothesis, then your alternative is going to have, again, the opposite or the complement, which is just a greater than. But notice, all of your symbols in the H1, none of them have equal to's, but all of the symbols in the null hypothesis that are possible do have equal to's. That's how you're going to know whether or not you land in either H0, the null hypothesis, or in H1, the alternative hypothesis. So what we're going to do first when we go into looking at these examples is we're only going to start by just stating our alternative hypothesis and our null hypothesis, our H0 and our H1. But before you can even do that, you have to come in and narrow in on the claim. So that's what we'll work on. And our claims will have different symbols in them, possibly. So let's take a look at that. So like we said, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to determine the claim. For our purposes, our claim is going to have one of three symbols to start. You'll have to pick your symbol, which is either we're going to be using P if we've got a proportion. We'll be using mu if we're talking about means. And we'll be using sigma if we're talking about standard deviation. And so this should again remind you of what we were doing in Chapter 7. In 7.1, we did confidence intervals for proportions P. In 7.2, we did confidence intervals for the mean mu. In 7.3, we did confidence intervals for the standard deviation sigma. So it's basically the same thing, but we're doing now, instead of confidence intervals, we're going to do shorthand hypothesis testing. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to choose a symbol, whether that's going to be P, mu, or sigma. And just like with confidence intervals, it told you what section you were going to be landing in. Same thing here. We'll handle P's with Z's like we did before in 7.1. We'll have, for means, we're going to have Z's and T's just like we did in 7.2. And unfortunately, just like in 7.3, when we did something for sigma, for standard deviation, we used chi-squared. We're going to use chi-squared. So it's going to be the same ideas. It's just looking at them through the eyes of hypothesis testing. So we've got our symbol that you'll have to choose first. Then you're going to have second, what's going to come after symbol is your inequality. And your inequality will be either one of those six symbols: a less than, a greater than, an equal to, a not equal to, a greater than or equal to, or a less than or equal to. So that's going to come in second. And then third, you're going to list out what other value goes on the other side. The value that you've got to be less than or greater than or not equal to. And this, once you pick out one of your symbols, along with one of your inequalities and your value, will make up your claim. So it's going to have three parts: your symbol plus one of your inequalities and then a value on the other side. After you figure out what your claim is, then that's where you're going to figure out where does it fit. What do I mean by where does it fit? I mean, does your claim fit as your H0 or your H1? Based on its symbol. We talked about this a second ago. If it has any version of equal to, it will fall in as your null hypothesis, your H0. If it does not, if it has a not equal to or a less than or a greater than, then it will fall in as your null hypothesis. Then once you have either one filled in, you need to figure out what the other one is, because they should be complements or opposites. Complements. And you are also going to want to label which one is the claim here. It's not really helpful at the beginning of our problems when we're doing the setup like this, but it will be helpful when we're done with our entire problems and we're kind of analyzing what our final answers are. So, but right now we're just going to be setting up our claim and our H0 and H1.